I think there's sort of this agency muscle that you build when you're outside of systems, and you start having these aha moments of like, oh yeah, you can just do things.
We funded a young man who's on his way to curing type 2 diabetes, hopefully. That's a company called Stark Therapeutics, and he's cured type 2 diabetes in animals and is moving towards human trials.
One of the ways that I like to talk about our 100K check is that it's not for spending a year to 18 months on something, it's for shooting yourself out of a cannon in about 4 to 6 months.
On this episode of the 632 Nanometer podcast, Danielle Strachman and Michael Gibson, founders of 1517 Fund and previously the Thiel Fellowship, join Mike and Xing Hui to share their new Flux Fellowship program, which is accepting applications for its second cohort. Danielle and Michael talk about their unique approach to venture capital, often funding people and ideas at their earliest stages with small checks that allow them to launch themselves out of a cannon, as Danielle puts it, spending 4 to 6 months making progress on their product and assembling their founding team. The group also takes some tangents to discuss ancient Greek philosophy, Gerardian mimetic traps, youth careerism, and the 1517 approach to filtering for exceptional founders. The Thiel Fellowship enabled young talents like Vitalik Buterin, founder of Ethereum, Dylan Field, founder of Figma, and Laura Deming, longevity science VC, and now cryopreservation biotech founder, to skip university and start building. At 1517 Fund, a more traditional VC structure, Danielle and Michael can start early but also support founders with funding through later rounds as their company grows. Over the last decade, they have also increasingly focused on sci-fi companies like Xeno Power, nuclear waste batteries, and atom computing, quantum computers. The Flux program from 1517 is something of a hybrid investment and fellowship. They fund scientists and basement tinkerers with a $100,000 check to catapult themselves out of the grant application labyrinth and into a sprint of high-agency startup building. This comes with a community aspect, including in-person cohort meetups, light mentorship, and a possibility of larger follow-on investments. Applications for the current Flux cohort close midnight Pacific Standard Time on May 11th with a 12-hour burning the midnight oil grace period.
Maybe we can just start off with some quick, just a couple minutes about yourselves and how you got into funding young people to work on ambitious projects.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to jump in, and thanks so much for having us. Michael and I have been working with ambitious, wily young people for 15 years. At first, that looked like our time at the Thiel Fellowship, working with Peter to launch the Thiel Fellowship program. We were fortunate enough to get to work with some people who would go on to become some of the tech greats, people like Vitalik Buterin, Dylan Field with Figma, of course, Laura Deming with the Longevity Fund, and now her cryopreservation startup, people like Ritesh Agrawal from Oyo Rooms. And early on, we saw that it was, even with those brilliant people, it was hard for them to get support past the Thiel Fellowship. So to make a long story short, 10 years ago, we launched 1517, our venture fund, as a fellowship 2.0 to really scale our work and be able to work with people over time. Because as awesome as the fellowship is, it's a one and done. You can fund someone once, and then no matter what, like that's all you get. So with 1517, we can go a very long haul with people and founders. And Michael can talk a little bit about, some of our founders, and then we can maybe go into Flux.
Okay. Well, there are a lot of them. I think at this point we've backed close to 200 companies over 10 years out of 1517. Let's see, they have a broad range of different things. We've done some classic Silicon Valley type stuff like enterprise software. Big company we supported was called Loom. They were acquired about a year and a half ago by Atlassian for nearly $1 billion. And what they do is they allow you to record on your screen, your screen plus your face, and it's just really quick and snappy, easy, and businesses love this, designers love this. So that's like classic startup stuff. But we've also backed some pretty hardcore hardware or science. A company called Luminar Technologies makes a perception system, LiDAR system for cars. Driverless or just driver assist, and their biggest customers, Volvo right now. That's a whole system, hardware, lasers, and so on. And so exciting to work with the founder, Austin Russell, on that. Over this time, over the last decade, we've been approaching more and more what we call sci-fi tech. This is stuff we think is just pulled from the pages of a sci-fi novel. A company that fits that category might be Xeno Power Systems. Back in the 1950s, there was this idea that you could use essentially nuclear waste. It still gives off radioactivity and heat. You could use this as a battery to power things, or you could just have a radioactive substance. Some of the first pacemakers, in fact, were powered by plutonium, which is pretty awesome. The U.S. government has a website you can see in case you find any of these old plutonium pacemakers out there. Very dangerous, but they lasted a long time. Xeno Power Systems, we met, young team out of Vanderbilt, had an idea about bringing us back to the future from the 1950s by bringing a nuclear battery to market. They're working with NASA and the U.S. military because these types of batteries are great for outer space or hard to reach places like the Arctic or underwater. So that's exciting to be a part of that. And then we've also, people working on some of the hardest problems in all of science. We've funded a young man who's on his way to curing type 2 diabetes, hopefully. That's a company called Stark Therapeutics, and he's cured type 2 diabetes in animals and is moving towards human trials. We have people working on fusion, quantum computing, just pretty far out there stuff. So that gives you a sense of the broad range of people we've worked with.
Very
That's
cool.
Cool. So at what stage do these companies typically approach you? So do they already have a working demo prototype? Because a lot of this is so far out that maybe there's only a concept. How do you decide if you want to fund it, if you think it's going to work?
Yeah, so we are angel pre-seed investors, and it's not that we fund something necessarily because we think it's going to work, but one of the questions we ask ourselves is it worth essentially spending resources, or in this particular case, money, and of course the founder's time is a huge resource as well, on answering questions that are unanswerable right now. So being able to really dig in and see, like, okay, what might it take to cure type 2 diabetes? Or, we have a quantum computer company called Atom Computing. And when that founder came to us, he was a thesis breaker for us, actually. He was all PhD'd up. We typically work with people without college degrees. But Ben was very impressive. This was in Fund 1 in our third year. It was our very last investment. We said, okay, if we were going to break our thesis of working with people without a degree, what would it be in the name of? And we said it would be in the name of science fiction. So we wrote the first check into that company. And, Ben mostly had, a lot of knowledge and a lot of ideas that he was knocking around. But this early capital got him started with prototyping. Going over the old lab in Berkeley was always amazing. Just all kinds of equipment and, I'd always tell him, like, start me at kindergarten here. What am I looking at? What is this? And one of the ways that I think we sort of cut our teeth on this is that when we were at the Teal Foundation, we were reviewing lots of applications of people, but also Peter was giving grants out to other people outside of the fellowship, and we got to meet the scientists and people he was backing, some of whom we thought were really, really wonderful and getting the job done, and some who seemed to be really good salesmen, but not so good on the execution side. So I think we learned from both the positive and the negative cases there. And oftentimes we're putting in, a small enough check to help someone get started, but we're not burning millions and millions of dollars right out of the gate. It's more like, hey, let's start you with 100K to 500K to see kind of what might happen here.
And what runway are you expecting to fund with that 100 to 500K? Is it like 6 months? So do you want to see something very quickly? And
It sort of depends on where they're at. One of the ways that I like to talk about our 100K check is that it's not for spending a year to 18 months on something. It's for shooting yourself out of a cannon in about 4 to 6 months. And then, we don't want to see necessarily like, oh, it's fully working, but we want to see, hey, this prototype is starting. Hey, they've gathered a couple team members. Now let's do $1 million to get them to the next step and go from there. Typically, in investing right now, a typical funding round will last about 18 months each. But especially with our really early angel check, we expect that to only be a handful of months to get started.
Before we dive into Flux, how did you guys originally get into, like, what were you doing before the Teal Fellowship? Just to give people like a
Sure.
color on just
Michael
yourselves.
and I often laugh because we always wanted an article out there that said a teacher and philosopher become VCs. We've never gotten that article. If anyone would like to write it, and put it out there. I mean, we've written those articles, but, I'm talking about,
I've written a book.
you've written a book. Yeah, exactly. But more press is always better. But I started a charter school in San Diego that's based on homeschooling philosophy and principles. And so, yeah, I was a school principal at one point, and I worked a lot with homeschoolers before that in a private tutoring company that I had.
Well, just prior to working on the Teal Fellowship, I was a journalist. I worked for MIT, actually. I wrote for Technology Review, which is originally the alumni magazine, but I guess because people were so interested in it, it now has a bit of a national distribution. And so my background is in philosophy and also ancient Greek, and that has
She
nothing to do
actually
with.
reads. Like, it's ridiculous.
I know. I just bought an exciting book at the local bookstore on Athenian coinage. Very interesting to me to this day. But working for Tech Review was a baptism by fire for sure into what the frontier of technology was and science was back in like 2007 and 8. And so that did give me a general sense of what was happening in the world, and it was through that I ended up meeting Peter Thiel.
Did you bring the mimetic desire, like René Girard's theory of mimetic desire, into the fund as
It's kind of hard to hear you, Xinghui. I don't know if it's.
Okay, yeah, you cut in
Maybe
and
you have
out
to
there,
take
but
your hair away from
But I
your.
think we caught the
yes,
gist of it.
I think you were
yes,
asking about Gerard's theory of mimetic desire,
yes,
And
and
if it informs the fund, I think is what you were asking.
exactly. Either as something you want to avoid or something that you think is driving.
yeah, I think it does. Probably so. The real quick, the Gerard's theory of desire is that it's rare or maybe never that we sort of originate our own desires. Oftentimes, we just merely copy other people, and oftentimes those people are rivals, and we're desiring some one thing that only one of us can possess, and so that creates this feedback loop, a runaway feedback loop of imitation and desire. Basically, Gerard says the more you compete for something, the more alike you become. And where I think Thiel takes that is the next step, which is to say the more alike we become, the less original we are, the fewer unique ideas we have. And we see that in our work in the fellowship. It's like, the whole application system and admissions committee for higher education, think of it like a contest for a limited number of spots. This is perfect. This is a hothouse for Girardian mimicry, where people are just competing along these dimensions to try to impress admissions committees. And the more they compete, the more alike they become, and therefore the less creative they are. And so with the fellowship, when that was started, it was like, hey, it's like the only winning move in the movie. What's that War Games line with Matthew Broderick? The only winning move is not to play. What if we gave people money not to compete in that race, but to do their own thing? And I think we carry that forward with 1517, where we celebrate uniqueness. We really want people to cultivate who they are as an individual. And I don't know if Gerard would think about it this way, but it is a sense in which conformism is a problem in our society and certainly in higher education. And so can we find ways to free people up, to liberate them, to do their own thing?
Yeah, so
Speaking.
academia has a very rigid system of evaluating people for tenure, for example, or even for hiring, having published X amounts of papers in fancy journals. So there are these very rigid structures, but at 1517, you still have to decide who to continue working with. So what is your set of criteria to decide that, which I assume is looser and individual?
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to character of the individuals that we're working with. The ideal with 1517 is actually not that we have a pitch meeting on a Wednesday and we have to go into diligence on a Friday, but that we've met someone out in the world somewhere, maybe at an event. Michael and I actually met Michael at a Foresight Institute event, and that's how, we got connected. And so we go to these places that are kind of, honeypots for nerds, basically. And we love to get to know them really early before they're building something. We often say we work with people who are makers before they're founders. And then we develop that relationship over time, sometimes months, sometimes years, and people will come back to us and say, hey, I've been thinking about something, and then kick around ideas. One of the things that we look for, though, is this trait called hyper-fluency, and it's this ability to talk backwards and forwards at like high speed and passion about something someone is wildly interested in. I talked to a young man in Kentucky yesterday who was just very interested in compute, and he was making all these interesting analogies about how compute is still in its infancy, and we forget that, like, as human beings. We're like, oh yeah, no, it's been around forever. It's like, in the grand scheme of human life, actually compute isn't in its infancy. And this guy had hyperfluency just up the wazoo. Like, he could talk about this for days. And it's also that passion of like that you're on the edge of your seat and you want to keep listening to this person. And then lastly, I think because both Michael and I, in different senses, we're going towards communicating ideas with people, either as a journalist or as a teacher, the ability to also scaffold one's language and talk to any audience is really important. So when Ben from Atom Computing came to our office, he asked us, what level of physics should I start at? And we said high school. And he started talking, and in about 3 minutes, we were like, hold on, time out. Why don't we go to middle school physics? He starts talking again. We say time out. And we came up with this line that we've used ever since, which was, talk to us like we're the dumbest golden retrievers you've ever met. And he really backed it up and gave us this amazing primer about everything he was doing in quantum computing. And so that ability to communicate to any audience, because you're building a team, you're working with experts, but you're going to be working with people who know nothing about what you're doing. It's really, really important. That's one, it's probably the key trait that we look for the most. But in Michael's book, actually, there's a whole chapter about, I think it's at least 8 traits that we look for very regularly. And then on the other side is we do have to believe that what the person's working on, could have venture scalability potential to it, because that's how we stay in business.
Some of it is our character traits that can only be revealed over time.
Yeah.
Because this old Aristotle principle of drama, but the action reveals character. Don't listen to what people are saying, but what they do. And so if people have a history of starting things, that's something we notice. It's also self-motivation. If they're doing something not to add an item on a college admissions essay or application, but because they're just intrinsically curious about it. Other things like a receptivity to awe and wonder is something we picked up on. I think it's just like they're naturally drawn to wondering, what this marvelous universe, how it works, and they'll worry about a discrepancy in data for weeks because they're just curious about what's going on. So these types of things, if we get to know someone over time, then more likely they're more authentic because you just see it in action without the promise of some reward.
Yeah, I think like one of the big problems of any kind of like program or anything like that is that once it gets prestigious, you get there's like this crowd, there's like this fundamental like layer of society that's like chasing different prestigious things, and they're all kind of equal potential for them. Like it's all doesn't matter, right, that much, but it's like needs to be prestigious. And I think definitely, I mean, that's something that's happened to Y Combinator to an extent, mostly for software startups, but it's like starting to happen for hard tech also. So it's really tough.
Well,
it's like
I did hear recently.
It's a problem of success. Like
maybe I saw it on a tweet, but it was something like that. There are now applications that people see for college where having a Y Combinator startup is like one of the things.
Yeah, and I remember when I was in high school, it was like you had to do fake volunteering or whatever.
Yes,
like,
right.
People around
conspicuous
me were like,
philanthropy.
Yeah, I was like gambling in the stairwell or something, and people were like going off to do fake volunteering for things they didn't even. It's like total nonsense that they don't care about or whatever.
Yeah.
We actually
But
have a funny gotcha question about this because one of the things that's important to us with the people we work with is genuineness. And this kind of goes back to the mimetic rivalry stuff too. When someone's genuine, there is that uniqueness and there's a themness to who they are. And we run a teen camp actually, and we have a light application for that because there's only 25 spots for camp. And I never ever thought this would be a gotcha question, but it turned out to be. One of the questions we ask is, what do you like to do for fun? And people answer it like a college application question. Oh, I love setting up my NGO. It's amazing. And it blew my
paperwork. I love
mind
paperwork.
that like young people weren't answering just like, I don't know, I skateboard, I do whatever.
Yeah.
And, I remember this one young lady who actually I had a mentoring call with her yesterday. We asked people to geek out about what that hyper-fluent area is for them. And she's really geeky on math, and she's just like, sharing about her mathiness. And then in her what do you like to do for fun answer, she said, I love cooking Lebanese food with my grandma. And I was like, she's who I'm looking for. Not the NGO, not the I wrote a book, not the, and it's a really important trait, I think, that we've picked up on, sort of just like stumbled upon it. I think part of it is that comparatively within the venture landscape, this happens a lot too. There's a lot of people who want to be investors. There's people out there who use the investor label and are not deploying any capital. So it's just wild throughout the startup ecosystem. And it's so funny to me on the mimetic side, because even these people who call themselves mimetic scholars, we met with a mimetic scholar once who literally flashed his flashy watch at us many times while we had lunch with him. And I was like, are you kidding me? Is this really happening? And like name dropping constantly. And I was like, what is wrong with the world right now?
Yeah.
I think
Amazing.
there's also some, kind of like this kind of rolls downhill in a way, because there are people in higher positions that are looking for people that can help them, do the start an NGO version of their job. So let's say they're like 50 and they're trying to like get the next XYZ thing, and they actually need those people that are willing to go through the bullshit to do
Yeah.
the fake work, to get the fake outcome, to
No!
then get the prize and the award and so on. So there's actually
It's
like
turtles
I
all
think
the
that,
way down.
yeah,
Pyramid
exactly. It's turtles
scheme.
all the way down to an extent. So there is like a reality to it that I think is it's not like just individually driven. It's also like the system pushes people
Oh,
in
yeah.
this direction.
Systems
But I
are
think that's
incredibly mimetic.
yeah, that's why I think there's a lot of value, kind of in what you guys are doing, and especially I think it's it's really missing in science and engineering, and it's a great moment to discuss the Flux program. So maybe you can just do like a quick 2-minute, like what is it and what's the motivation behind the program?
Well, it started with a conversation with you. I mean, we had been brainstorming a little bit about this for some of the reasons we've touched on, that in order to get into grad school, you've got to appeal to the professors in that department, and you do that best by maybe, adding a decimal point to their view. And then once you get in there, it's like, who are your dissertation advisors? It's like the same game you just described over and over all the way up. And so maybe you're 30 or 35 by the time you get to command some grant money.
Do
and
any
maybe
of your
take a
own
risk.
experiments. Like,
No, but at that point you still haven't gotten tenure, so you're actually
All right.
still,
So, okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah, you
40.
have to go to
So
like
maybe you're
45.
40. Yeah.
Exactly.
And this is in the data. Like, there's some research by this economist Ben Jones who looked at this stuff, and it's like you see over the last 120 years, the average age at which people do things like earn their PhD or write their first paper, that's all gone up.
well, and
quite
actually,
a
I
bit.
really want to hammer that home a little bit harder, because what's interesting is, if I have the numbers correctly, it used to be like 100 years ago that age of like first invention was somewhere around 23, and then age of like major invention was 30. But it turns out it's scaffolded up by about 10 years because of these systems like the PhD, racket. But it turns out it's not that you like do your first invention at 30 and then get your major invention at 40. It turns out the older you are when you start your first invention, the least likely you are to get to that major inflection point. And it literally just never happens. And it blows my mind. And it's both it's like sad and wild that like all you got to do is start people earlier. So this is a big part of what Flux is to break people out of those systems, no matter what their age is. We don't have an age cap on Flux, to be like, hey, you need to get started now because we know you have a shot on goal at doing something completely transformative.
And like we discussed with you, Michael, maybe there are people in their PhDs or postdocs, or even we've had, let's say, not, what is it? Assistant professors or whatever, but it's like people who just do want to take a shot on something more unorthodox, less incremental. There's also, when it comes to this stuff, it's not just that, it's not just like how you advance through the hierarchy. It's also just, let's say, the grant process, where these grants the applications are very complicated. The review process takes forever. So we thought we could be fast with the money as well. It's like we have an application, but it shouldn't take more than, 30, 45 minutes. So we thought, okay, we can be fast, give people some resources to try some experiments over the summer, and maybe that experiment is like one that proves or shows that this idea can be commercialized. So we're still limited, and maybe that's like a point of criticism here, is like we are limited to, this is a investment, it's not a grant. And so these ideas have to lead to some kind of commercial activity, and therefore maybe we're like leaving out some basic science. But maybe one day it's like we can start to move out further into the crazy.
What's the structure? Like how does it work? How big is the financial
Sure.
gain from getting in? What's how is it? What's the time commitment and so on?
Yeah. So we typically write a 100K check. It's flexible. We ask each person like, hey, what is actually the amount that works? So we've gone up a little bit. We've gone down a little bit for people. It's on a safe. So it is an investment in a Delaware C Corp or a C Corp. We don't really care what.
So a safe, for people that don't know what that is you have a corporation, and the safe is a simple agreement for future equity. It's a document developed by Y Combinator to make it very easy for founders to take money from investors, and without pricing it. So basically, the price gets set in the future when you sell equity in a more formal way. Like if your startup takes off and you have something like it's called a price round, where there's actually a set price for the equity.
Yep, that's correct. And then the intention is that people will work on things for between 4 and 6 months just to see, hey, can this get some legs? And then our intention actually is that we really are partnering up with our founders. We're here to be additional resources for them. So if things are going really well, we want to back the company and the founder with another $1 million shortly thereafter to really get them going. And so we've done this with our first, Flux batch, where when people have made incredible progress, we're there to do more funding for them. And Flux also started because of Zeno Power, because we put $50K into that company. Michael mentioned them earlier. They're our nuclear battery company. And we, in that sense, we start with that small check. They started assembling a team and building some prototypes. I think we came in with something like $250K later. This is in Fund 1 when we had a smaller fund. And then we followed on all the way throughout, and they're a Series B company now. And we've supported them with additional later stage capital also. So we like to think of ourselves as very early partners, helping to spark innovation and ideas and giving people a shot. And then if things are going well, very long-term partners as well. And then also I'll mention like community is actually really important and a big part of what we do at 1517. There isn't a physical space component to Flux. People don't have to move to San Francisco or anything like that. We're really into garage science and basement science and like wherever you need to work, and people use CROs and there's all kinds of ways to build things these days. But we do have in-person components as far as we have events where people get together, and come somewhere. We have founder retreats and things like that. So there's ways to get that peer connection time, but they're not bound to any location.
So 2 important questions. When are applications due? And what are some examples? So you've run this is the second time you're running this. What are some examples of projects that you guys funded that you're excited about from last
All right,
year?
applications due tomorrow. I
No,
don't know
no,
when this
no,
comes out.
no. Applications are due on May 11th, Sunday.
Oh, okay.
And
What time is it? Is it like midnight?
It's midnight Pacific, but technically the application, we have like a grace period of I think 12 hours. Where if someone's burning the midnight oil and just needs to get it in, I will say to anyone listening, on the where we ask everybody to send in like a 3 to 5 minute video, we want it to be casual. We want it to be genuine. We do not want the TikTok flashy edited thing. So people are like, I'm still working on my video. I'm like, just sit down and record something. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. So yes, Sunday is the deadline, May 11th. And one thing I'll also say is that we're running Flux all the time, but just not as an application. So what we found is that some people need that forcing function of a date of okay, I need to know this is when I need to put my idea out there by. But we work with founders all the time when they come to us and say, hey, I'm working on this really strange thing. I need 100K, I need 500K, I need $1 million to get going. And that's our job. So if anyone's listening and is like, oh, darn, I missed the Flux application, just write to us and we're happy to walk you through our investment process.
Yeah, the place to find that application is Danielle's Twitter account. So Danielle Strachman, just find her. She's tweeted a bunch.
And it'll be in the show notes.
Oh,
also.
okay, in the show notes, great. But otherwise, if you just want to reach out to us on our website, that's fine too. You asked about an example. So we had I don't know, I think he found us on Twitter actually.
He did.
Or maybe he saw the announcement.
Yeah, he found us on Twitter.
And he was a researcher, part of Howard Hughes in Los Angeles, and had been working in material science, and he had some ideas about copper, replacing copper. Copper, the price of copper has gone up quite a bit as demand has increased over the years, just a bigger global economy, and then more and more intensive uses for things. Like there's something called a heat sink. This is a way of diffusing heat in data centers, and as computation becomes more or just a bigger enterprise, something as simple as a copper heat sink becomes more important. So Amir he had some ideas about creating a composite based on nanomaterials. He needed to run an experiment to grow essentially the first batch of this. So the 100K went towards that. What's pretty funny is he lives in a condo in Calabasas, which is a hot area just over the Santa Monica Mountains. And those people like to leave their cars in their garages because sometimes it's 100, 105 degrees out. Well, Amir needed a space to run these experiments, and so he had to kick his girlfriend's car out of his garage, and she was not too happy.
Better have kicked his car out too. You can't just kick his car out.
Well, he didn't have, yeah, his car was already out.
I was gonna say, his must have been already out.
So he ran that experiment, and it went according to plan. The results were positive. So we provided him with more resources, invested $1 million to now perfect the process of making that composite. He brought on two friends who were off working at other companies but really wanted to join the startup and get it going. They're still in the garage. They now have lots of equipment. And Amir, he did say that all his stuff is out of the garage completely now, so bikes and other things. So it's a full enterprise. So they're working on the process. I think in the next few months, once those results are in on perfecting that, then they're going to raise the next big round of money, and hopefully at that point they think they'll be able to afford an office or lab space. So we love this story because the idea of a garage is real. That's like Hewlett Packard started in a garage, Apple started in a garage, and what we're starting to see, that's kind of, I mentioned basic science. We're just starting to see more and more science ideas out of a garage. Or not even in a garage. Like there are these CROs you can use now where people can run experiments by hiring labs at universities, essentially renting them out for pretty cheap because universities are so hungry for money that you can actually do quite a bit on fewer and fewer resources nowadays. So Amir's story fits that narrative pretty well, and we're excited to see him start selling that replacement for copper.
So I have a question for Xinghui. So you're obviously, spent most of your career in academia, and if you imagine yourself as a postdoc, which was, relatively recent, or as a PhD student, what would be your reservations about doing this? Like about applying to this program, or leaving your postdoc to work on something for, take a shot at something for 6 months? Like, what would your reservations be? And we can kind of have like an open discussion whether they can be addressed.
Yeah, no, from talking to people who I've encouraged, like some of my students, to apply for this, and I'm not precluding being ever interested in this myself, is that most people have been very firmly in a system up until they decide that there may be something wrong with it. And so they're used to some illusion of safety that they think they might be departing if they move outside of a system that has clear rules. So the rules, on the one hand, they are confining, but they also give that illusion of safety. So what are things that you would tell people to break out of that mindset that they need to know what the next step or the second to next step is after applying for, let's say, flux capacitor?
One of the things that we talk to people about a lot is that there's always something you can do to get started. It's not about getting flux or not getting flux. It's about what can you do to start moving your ideas forward. And maybe that's talking to peers, maybe that's talking to collaborators, maybe that's reaching out to people, maybe that's experimenting in the garage or the kitchen and just starting to take that action. I think there's sort of this agency muscle that you build when you're outside of systems, and you start having these aha moments of like, oh yeah, you can just do things. You can just set up something in the kitchen, in the garage. And I think even that those moments are impactful, even if what you're working on doesn't go somewhere. And I think because we're in systems so much, we like the biggest illusion I think is actually in the system, that if you fail in the system, it means you failed at life. And like we all know that that's just not true. We just know that there's so many different paths people go on, and different ways to do things. And it's not about pleasing a committee or looking a certain way. These tend to look like either they call it the quarter life crisis, or in some people's cases, it's the midlife crisis, where you're like, oh my God, I've been on this escalator and I didn't realize it, and now I'm here. I think that's a developmental milestone. I think it's actually really good for people to go through it because it wakes you up. It's kind of this shakeup of, oh wow, wait a second, I need to live according to my own values and not pleasing committees. So we saw this in the fellowship too, of that going into an unstructured environment and doing your own project or research or startup is very different and a very big, learning experience. But I think what every single one of them would say was that they learned more by doing outside of that system, both about the doing, but also about themselves, than they would have if they stayed inside of it. And then lastly, I'll just say is that like those systems, like as much as we would like them to mostly evaporate, they're going to be there. And so if people want to go back to those systems, they can, and that's a choice.
Yeah, and I think another thing for deep tech that is very hardware heavy is that at universities you tend to have access to a lot of resources, for instance, like clean rooms where you can make chips, or shared infrastructure for quantum computing. How
Those
have people
resources aren't free. Let's be really clear. The university is going to take IP for using their equipment. So
Yes.
let's just be really clear that it's not
Oh,
like
100%. Nothing is free.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can maybe address that question a little bit. I mean, there are a lot of ways to, let's say 100K is not a lot, right? So it's not going to last you for years, but there are a lot of ways to leverage university resources
Sure.
that are like, pay per use, right? So they become more expensive if you're a startup and so on. But there are all kinds of hacks and ways of like you can do contract research agreements with your own, with your own professor, so you can keep using their equipment, but under a different contract and things like that. We did some of that at Sci-Fi when we were starting. I think actually, just while Danielle was talking, I'm just remembering my own quarter life crisis. I had the exact opposite crisis. So I had started a startup in my undergrad, late in my undergrad. Then I sold it. I worked at the acquirer, and I was at 25. I was like, oh my God, I've been doing all these high agency just a person in the wild, not, and just making lots of mistakes and having disasters and so on. And I just realized like I need to go back into a system. Like I need a system where I can like learn from people that know what they're doing. I'm just like so I basically went back to academia. I like spent like 5 years in like first at Technion and then at MIT, and that was like amazing for me. But it was a very hard transition because suddenly instead of like, okay, what are we doing now? It's like, okay, I have to deal with all these like paths that have been set up and like squeeze myself into these like strange tubes and so on. But it was like so I think going back and forth actually has a lot of benefit, and a lot of people used to do that. You can go back and listen to a podcast by from Eli Yevlanovich, who's like a really famous professor in photonics, and he went like he worked at Harvard, then Bell Labs, then Harvard, then UCLA. He did startups, this back and forth, like this whole thing of like, okay, you have to be this arrow that's like aimed at the heart of tenure, and you just like a straight shot. You never sleep, but never stop, never like pause for 3 months, just like think about existence, whatever. Like you just have to, like, that's, I think, false. It's true that might be like the highest chance thing you can do, but then you're giving up on all the other possibilities in life, right? So I think just it's much more of a porous membrane than you think, and I think there's a lot of possibility to do ladder hacking, where it's like you can't even reach this point if you go straight, just because it's completely clogged. Like there's 1,000 people trying to get through the same hole, but there might be like ways to go around if you're successful in a different area. So I think there's a lot to be said of like going back and forth or just being flexible about like what your career means.
And that flexibility is so important. I think one of the things that I mentor people on the most is to not get caught up in putting yourself in any form of a label. Like, I am a student, I am a researcher, I'm a startup guy, I'm a this. Like, because as soon as you take on the label, when you think about leaving it, there's this like, oh no, I'm not the thing that I've been telling people I am, or something like that. But keeping it flexible of like, hey, yeah, now I'm going to Bell Labs. Hey, now I'm going to a startup. Hey, now I'm over here and I'm doing these things. Like, you can always make a new choice of like, okay, what's the right thing for you right now, instead of just acting out this label into your future when maybe it doesn't fit anymore. Your story made me laugh a little bit on the inside because it's very reminiscent of like classic hero's journey. The person like leaves the system, they go on their journey, and then they like come back around to the thing, but they're different. So they're able to interface with the system in a different way.
Yeah. I think you also get an appreciation for all the comforts of the system if you leave, right? I think it's very easy to be complacent. Like one thing I noticed when I was in grad school is like people didn't really like it. They weren't having a good time, and I was having so much fun because I hadn't had access to any. Just like being around a bunch of people doing exciting things and everything. People were so complacent about it, and I was like, having so much fun.
Well, it's because you chose it. Like you proactively, consciously chose to be there. Whereas most people get on that escalator or moving walkway and they're not even thinking about it. And so of course you get like complacent and meh, and because you're not really choosing. You're not at high agency for that decision. But you were.
I think regarding Flux, I think it's good to also answer the question of like, just to make it less of a black box, like how baked should your idea be to make it really like reasonable to apply? Like, do you have to have any
start
idea?
If someone just has an idea and like has done no experiments or whatever, that's fine. I mean, just like convince us with who you are. We think character matters more than anything else. So if you're able to convey a sense about why you're the person who should work on this and get us excited about it, that could be enough. But sure, yeah, if you have some initial data or a prototype, that could be good too. But
in the previous batch, were there any foreign founders? Did that work out? I remember that being like a question that came up a lot.
So yeah, we're very open to people globally applying. Of course, like if they want to come to the events that we have in the U.S. and things like that, that can get a little challenging. But we're very open to folks, being international for it. I'm trying to think if anyone, I don't remember if anyone in the first batch is.
My question was actually somebody in the U.S., but on a visa and like trying to navigate that.
So we have someone on staff now who's really up to speed on the current thinking around the O1 visa and what's required. Those I say current thinking because it's like I wish this was just like clear, bright line conditions, but it's an application process. And she has a good understanding and knows some lawyers. So we're gonna take applications and we'll see what we can do to help people with this type of visa.
Yeah, we've helped lots of people get the O1.
Very cool.
Yeah.
But there is the requirement that you need to be able to form a U.S. corporation as well. So, those are usually state-based, and people just say Delaware.
But we have a company, Commenda, that can help people do this.
Yeah, that's true. We do.
So-
Good point.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But that would be okay as a team. So if you had one international founder, if one of them
For
is
sure,
able
yeah.
to do that, that would be sufficient.
Yep.
Yeah, in fact, I think there is. I think America is just still the NBA of it's the Olympics of entrepreneurship, especially when it comes to ambition and pursuing these things. And so, in a sense, when I meet scientists in Europe, mainly because I haven't been to other countries, but in Europe, I just see they don't have the resources to do these things. I meet a lot of brilliant scientists who have deep tech ideas, but they don't have, there might be some initial funding, but when you get to the further levels of like Series A, Series B, these European investors are just so risk averse. It's hard for any of these people to raise money. The next thing is the culture's not there. The ambitions are smaller, fragmented because of the different nations. So it's like tough to really dream big. So I think if I could airlift people from these places to the U.S., I think I would do it, and maybe Flux is a vehicle for
Catalyst for that. Yeah.
Very cool. Is there anything that we didn't cover that people should know about, or that you just wanna
One thing
take
that
a
I was
chance
just
to talk
thinking about is like just from a programmatic standpoint, we are going to do a kickoff event for Flux on June 27th in San Francisco, where we're just going to get those people together for a full day to kick off. Like they'll get the money before then, and they'll be getting started, but that's just a date for people to have on their minds.
Okay, awesome. Thanks a lot for your time. I think it's really helpful for people to hear like just a little bit more directly from you about it. And I really I really wish this existed when I was younger, and it was more would have been really relevant for me. And I think it's a great thing, and hopefully it grows. But not too big to become like a prestige prestige engine,
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
I hope it has a long runway before
We
it
want to
gets
stay
like a
small, weird, and nerdy. So
yeah, exactly. Thanks Danielle, Michael,
Okay,
and
Michael, thanks for having us on.
cool.
Yes,
you
thanks.
both. This is great.